Welcome on, everyone. Dan Feldman joining us here for the YouTube, and we'll do a few faces for the thumbnail, and then we'll get started on tonight's show. If you bear with us, we're going to talk about some of the notable trades in NBA history when a star was traded not for really future assets, but for at the time at least, perceived lesser star in a attempt to remain competitive, and we'll see what the result of that has been historically as we go through it. But first, my reaction to Dan Feldman doing this show from his local daycare.
Trying to figure out whether Chauncey Billups or Allen Iverson was perceived as the lesser star at the time.
Steph Curry, 56 points at age 36. Sadly, we won't have a chance to talk about that on today's episode, but certainly a future one. We will get to that. All right, let's do a show. Welcome on, everyone, to a Thursday night edition of Dunc'd On and Dunc'd On Prime. I want to remind everyone, link is in the show notes to Dan's free edition of his newsletter twice a week. His daily dunks, although maybe only once a week while Danny is on paternity leave, are available for your free consumption. And of course, we thank you for subscribing to Dunc'd On. And if you want to get 6 episodes per week, including every Hollinger and Duncan, you can subscribe to Dunc'd On Prime. So let's do our main thing first here, and then we can get to the news. There's nothing too sexy in the news, really. So what are we trying to discuss here, Dan?
We're looking at a history of trades where a team traded a star for a lesser star. A lot of the trades we see when a team trades a star, it's trading away for draft picks for young players. But on occasion, they're looking for a proven veteran. I think we had 3 of them this year, loosely. There's going to be some gray areas. I'm sure that's something we'll discuss, whether a trade qualifies or not. Anybody listening, watching on YouTube, I'd love to see some comments. We put this list together of trades that seemingly qualified, but I'm sure there are some we missed, or at least that are arguable that we missed. But this year, the big one, of course, the Mavericks trading Luka Doncic for Anthony Davis. Also, the Kings trading De'Aaron Fox for Zach LaVine. And I'd argue, roughly, if we're taking a very wide lens look at this, I would say the Heat trading Jimmy Butler for Andrew Wiggins also qualifies.
Yeah, we can cool with that. I don't know. Andrew Wiggins, a little bit more of a role player. Also, Butler, I don't know how high his value was at that point. I mean, I think that's part of what I was trying to capture in doing this. And all these will be instructive, so we'll go through them because they're fun to talk about. But the big reason that I wanted to talk about this was that teams, when they make a trade, have a choice. Kevin Durant almost got traded himself. The Suns would have been making a choice there as well. The choice is you have, because almost always in these, not entirely, we'll get to some examples where that's not the case, but almost always in these cases, the team is forced to make a trade, whether it's due to a contract situation, the guy about to leave, the guy being suspended for many, many games for not rendering services, whatever that may be, they have to trade the guy usually. And then the question is, what are you going to go after? Are you going to go after a package of future assets and accept that you may not be good for a while? Or do you say, no, we can still maintain this level? Our goal is to be as good as we can right now in the wake of this trade. And what have the results been of taking that latter approach? And so let's start. We'll go back in. I think it's notable, actually, that in this supposedly enlightened age of 2025, we saw at least 2 of these sorts of trades where the teams eschewed getting back future assets, really, and went for more. They got a few of those to sort of equalize the value, but they went for another player. And as we'll go through this, you'll see the part of the reason the Doncic trade was so unprecedented, Dan, was just we hadn't seen this level of star traded for another star of this level basically ever.
The Doncic trade is such an outlier because I don't know if we've seen that level of the star traded, period. Any circumstances for anything ever. I mean, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar going to the Lakers, maybe a Wilt Chamberlain trade. There's like maybe a couple in NBA history, but that one is up there as a standout. Just to go over a little more of some of the parameters we're looking for whether one of these trades qualifies. One thing is it's a little bit cyclical no matter how you do it. It's kind of like defining a player's position by who he defends. You have to define somebody's position at some point to do that. So we're looking at stars who are good enough to be traded for another star. That's one way we're defining whether that was a star. And we're also looking at the return, the perceived star or near star or maybe arguable star had to be a key component of the return. Like you said, there's going to be some of these trades that also included draft picks, that also included young players. But as long as we view it as the lesser star was a key component, that's our threshold.
Yeah, and another one is it's not necessarily that the guy became a star, right? We kind of talked through this and tried to decide which ones we're going to include beforehand. One of the ones that you brought up that we decided not to include was Domantas Sabonis for Tyrese Haliburton, because Tyrese Haliburton was basically a prospect. That was entirely a future-focused move by the Indiana Pacers. Now, Haliburton was pretty good. You could certainly say, well, all right, we think we're going to be better sooner rather than later. But you're at that point in time, Sabonis was just obviously considered the better player. Haliburton was known more as a prospect and not necessarily a future all-star, though he really pretty much began playing at an all-star level the moment that he joined the Pacers. And yeah, Raw has it here in the comments too. Another one that's happened this league year, although it happened in 2024, Karl-Anthony Towns for Julius Randle. That's probably the one we should start with here.
Yeah, another one like Luka Doncic that was really made by the Greater Stars team's choice. They didn't have to trade Karl-Anthony Towns. We could see the financial reasons that they wanted to, but he wasn't pressing for a trade. They could have paid him. It wasn't inevitable that they had to trade him, but they made a choice and they traded him for an older player, for a veteran, but somebody perceived to be a star in Julius Randle.
Yeah,
and Dante DiVincenzo.
Yes, yeah. Well, and DiVincenzo is part of that too. Now, he wasn't necessarily a star, but I think that the Wolves felt like they maybe acknowledged that they would be taking a little bit of a step back. I actually thought they wouldn't be taking a step back. I probably was wrong about that, although, again, who knows what would have happened. Like, Karl-Anthony Towns is mostly an offensive player, and the Wolves' defense has been what's taken such a step back. I think you would be hard-pressed to argue that Karl-Anthony Towns, okay, you can tell me he's a little bit better defensively than Julius Randle, but he's not. He wasn't going to make them be 3 points per 100 better than league average, just like they were last year if you sub in Karl-Anthony Towns for Julius Randle at this point in time. So remains to be seen whether this is a miscalculation. Obviously, there were many financial components to this one as well. And that's another thing that will remain to be seen. The Wolves, you could probably argue that they put themselves in better position 2-3 years from now. And when Karl-Anthony Towns is going to be on the downside and making high 50s, low 60s. So this one still remains to be seen. I don't know that this is the best example of the type necessarily. This was one where, and Karl-Anthony Towns was not like such a big star, and he also wasn't a guy who had to be traded. I thought this next one was
real quick
pretty hilarious.
Real quick before you leave Towns, to me, it's one of the best examples. Comparing it to the Luka one, maybe not so much the De'Aaron Fox example, but where the team chose to. As we can get into, it's rare that a team chooses to do this, and that influences it. I think in the end, we're going to try and take somewhat of an accounting. Is this a right way to approach things or the wrong way to approach things? And the important thing to remember is when your star wants out, when your star has problems, when your star is on a huge contract, or there's some dispute, there's something going wrong, and you have to trade the bigger star, you're probably headed for problems anyway. The Timberwolves made a choice to do this like Dallas did.
Yeah, and when you as the team have more leverage, the standard should be higher, I would say, that because you're already good in theory, and to just punt that away for whatever, I guess, financial savings or flexibility or down the line or whatever it is, that is, if you're going to do that, you better actually think that you're getting better. So it is a little bit different of a situation. Yeah.
And then one other thing on Cat, the defense. No, he's not a defensive stopper, but the one thing he had was chemistry that he had developed with Rudy Gobert in particular, but the Timberwolves in general. And so when you choose to make one of these trades, you're choosing to disrupt your chemistry. So I can see how that would affect the Timberwolves, even though Cat wasn't a stopper. So I don't know. I do think that one, there's a lot there that applies. But now we can jump to that next one that I know you got a kick out of.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And again, not sure how well this fits into the type, but what was this deal?
In 2019, the Oklahoma City Thunder traded Russell Westbrook for Chris Paul. And I think this fits really well because not only were they still stars at the time, both made all-star games after. I've written before about clear and enduring star trades because sometimes a guy's over the hill or he's not a star yet. And how do you judge it? And I'm always intrigued by the trade where a guy was an all-star before and an all-star after, traded for another player who also fits these parameters. And those two did.
Now, where I think it breaks down on this one is that the Thunder had clearly made the decision to rebuild. This wasn't necessarily an attempt to remain competitive. In fact, I think they would have almost preferred to have been less competitive in this season than they ended up being the 2020 season. And as it turned out, they were nearly as good as the Rockets and then actually played them in the playoffs that year, almost beat them. Russell Westbrook was injured, as it turned out. I think did he miss game 7? He missed a large part of that series, wasn't himself. And then that was really the last we heard from him on the Houston Rockets. And then he was traded for John Wall. We're not going to argue that John Wall was a star at that point. But the terms of this deal, remember, of course, the Thunder had already traded away Paul George at that point and gotten back Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and one of the largest, if not the largest, draft pick hauls ever. And so in this deal, the Thunder also got a 2021 first, a top 4 protected 2024 first, a 2025 first, I think it was a swap, and a 2026 pick, top 4 protected. And so that it really, Chris Paul was just the vehicle they were getting back. I think had they been able to move him for value right then, they would have. And in fact, the Thunder, despite making the playoffs the year after, they're the perfect example of the team who they weren't trying to throw good money after bad and remain competitive, because then they just moved Paul for what ended up being actually a really low first round pick in the end to Phoenix. And Phoenix ended up being awesome in that 21 season. Chris Paul made his only finals appearance. So this worked out amazingly well for the Thunder. But I would argue, although I hate this phrase, the exception that proves the rule, because the rule shouldn't have that many exceptions. But this is one where the purpose of it was Chris Paul was viewed as like a terrible contract. He wasn't viewed as like, oh, let's get him and we'll remain competitive. Like, he was injured in 2019. He was called the worst contract that Tillman Fertitta had ever seen in business or sports. Do you remember that quote?
Yeah.
That was amazing. So I think in terms of the perception at the time, like, Chris Paul was way better than Russell Westbrook after this, but that wasn't the thinking. He was just a vehicle for taking on. He was viewed as a big time negative asset, and the Rockets were deemed to have to pay OKC in draft picks to get him.
I'm going to make some counter arguments here. Chris Paul was viewed that way overall. I thought at the time it was a little harsh. I didn't expect him to rebound as well as he had, but I wouldn't be shocked if the Thunder put some value in. Well, if this guy is the matching salary, maybe we can rehab his value and get positive return with him outgoing.
Oh, sure.
It's like,
but they thought they were also going to just take out. Yeah. I mean, that's what Sam Presti did with so many guys in that era, including Al Horford. But yeah, obviously a brilliant trade by the Oklahoma City Thunder.
And also the Thunder had so many extra draft picks so that they could it wasn't so bad that they were better than expected because a lot of their picks were from other teams. Also, I think Chris Paul had a great influence on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, helped SGA develop. And here's the last point I want to make that I think is going to apply to some of these other trades. In this era, you have to have matching salary. You can't just trade a player for draft picks most of the time. Sometimes you can, especially in the offseason, but oftentimes you can't. So sometimes I think teams are tilted toward this type of trade, even if they would prefer younger prospects who make less money or draft picks. That's not always tenable. And maybe the most tenable trade, maybe you're open to one style or the other, and the only one that you can make financially is for this type of lesser star. I think that might come up other times too.
Yeah, but this one, though, they still got paid in terms of the assets in addition to getting back the player. It wasn't, they didn't take back less so that they could also get the players. So this wasn't one where I think that decision was made. This next one, though, is maybe the quintessential example of this and where I think it goes wrong. Quite frankly, I'm going to see if I can do this trade from memory. Kawhi Leonard for DeMar DeRozan. The Spurs also, for some reason, included Danny Green in this deal, who was like a really good player and ended up winning a championship in Toronto. Like Green, to me, I mean, I guess they felt they needed him for the matching salary. And then they got back Jakob Poeltl, who would later be traded back from San Antonio to Toronto, and ended up being the pick that was Rob Dillingham that they got a 30 swap and a 31 first from the Wolves for. They got a 2019 first from Toronto, trading Kawhi there. You knew they were going to be really good. In fact, that was the 29th pick, became Keldon Johnson. And I guess as I look at it here, there was also cash. Also, that 2019 first was top 20 protected. So it really was, and that was one where maybe the Lakers might have been interested in him. The Lakers had the package that eventually became Anthony Davis that they could have given, which would have been way better. The Clippers didn't have a ton. Like Kawhi obviously ended up there as a free agent, but it seemed very clear that the Spurs, given where Greg Popovich was in his career, still had so much influence in the organization, maybe even the final decision rested with him. They still had LaMarcus Aldridge, who was on the tail end, who frankly probably should have been traded himself. And the Spurs ended up just completely in the wilderness. It worked out for them because they got Victor Wembanyama, but even it took them a really long time to even be bad enough to start picking at the top of the draft. They were competitive for a while on the backs of guys like DeJounte Murray, who they took number 29, and DeRozan and Poeltl. Like they did get the 7th seed in 2019, and then they would not make the playoffs after that. I would argue that this one, yeah, they eventually got Victor, but you couldn't have known that that was what was going to happen 5 years after. And there was no need for them to be as bad as they've been. And they still are, they're going to be now going, even with Victor, they're going to be going on not having made the playoffs since 2019 for a franchise that had only missed the playoffs, was it twice up until 2019 in their NBA existence?
Yeah, I wonder how much that playoff streak influenced this. If they had kept the streak going, even sneaking in, I could have maybe justified some value in going that direction. But when the streak ended, it was clear that this was the wrong way to go. It is a little tricky to know what they could have gotten for Kawhi if they went the other way, the classic picks in young players, given Kawhi's injury, given him being on an expiring contract. Yeah. I don't know. It's tough to say.
To be one of the LA teams. But I mean, the Lakers had just gotten LeBron that offseason. They would have been very desperate to add something to him. As it turned out, they pretty much wasted that 18-19 season with LeBron and a bunch of young guys until they got AD. Like that was LeBron in his age 34 season. You would have thought that would be the best season of his career remaining, and they just didn't have a team around. I think they would have been very, very. And remember, for the Pels, like it wasn't obvious that AD was going to be available. Like they had just had a really nice playoffs, swept the Blazers, and it looked like their team could take a step forward. Then 18-19 was a disaster, and Davis was wanting out by midseason.
Yeah, the injury for the LA teams, you're right. The expiring contract would be less of a concern. It's the injury where if a team has a certain diagnosis and doesn't like his long-term outlook, then they're not going to be giving up as much. But yes, I do think the Spurs could have done better. And I agree 100% that this is the best example we're going to see on this. This is the quintessential one, like you said.
Next one.
In 2017, the Cavaliers traded Kyrie Irving, and a big part of the return was we learned later, very damaged Isaiah Thomas. I thought this was an absolute heist for the Cavs at the time. I thought Isaiah Thomas was almost as good as Kyrie Irving, maybe a better regular season player, but because of his size, wouldn't hold up quite as well deep in the playoffs. Turns out Isaiah Thomas could barely play anymore.
Yeah, and of course, they had the unprotected Nets pick from in 2018, and in 16 and 17, those picks had beget Jaylen Brown in 16 from the KG trade. Then the next year, they'd gotten the number 1 pick, ended up trading down for Jason Tatum. Man, my analysis in 2017 was not that good. I fucked up that draft. Didn't like that trade for the Celtics to get Tatum. I didn't really like the Kyrie trade for them either. Obviously, it didn't turn out because Kyrie kind of, things didn't work out for him there personally, but it was certainly pretty solid run. They had just gotten Gordon Hayward too, so they were really ready to win. Never know what would happen if Hayward doesn't get hurt there. Right. I mean, that's just so insane that happened 2 minutes into his Celtics career. But anyway, returning slightly from memory lane, that Nets pick ended up being number 8 overall. They drafted Colin Sexton with it in 2018. There were actually a lot of really, really good players that they could have drafted instead of Colin Sexton in that range that they didn't. But they of course went, this is one where they went probably more for future stuff than certainly LeBron James would have preferred. They probably should have gotten even more for present stuff in that trade than they did. And Kyrie had 2 years left on his deal. He was able to kind of dictate things. He also put the organization under pressure because reportedly he threatened to get knee surgery, which he actually ended up needing in the end in that 18 season. So that wasn't at least like total bullshit. Like he had enough behind it to actually get that. Because remember, he'd fractured his kneecap. He had like the wire in there. And then that caused him problems. He had to get the surgery. I think it was March of 18. So just a very, very weird trade with 2 teams who had just played each other in the conference finals, transacting a trade. Everyone knew LeBron was going to leave pretty much after that 18 season. So he wouldn't sign on the dotted line to stick around longer. So they went for the more future focused asset. I think you would still say that more than Isaiah Thomas, that Nets pick was the reason that the Cavs went in that direction. Would you agree with that?
I mean, especially in hindsight, knowing how hurt Isaiah Thomas was at the time, I thought, wow, the Cavs are in a bind with Kyrie forcing a trade, and they managed to get a point guard who's about as good. I also thought Jake Crowder, who's involved in that trade, would be a really good role player for the Cavs. The chemistry there was never right at all. And so I thought that Nets pick was really a bonus. And the way I think contending teams should go all in, I thought the Nets pick was an asset they could trade. And the alternative, this is one where we at least know somewhat more about the alternative path. I've seen different things on how this would have worked and what the Cavs would have traded, but there was talk they could have traded Kyrie Irving for Paul George, but didn't want to do it unless they knew LeBron was staying, and LeBron wouldn't commit to that. But that is a possibility of the direction they could have gone.
This next one, so we didn't see any from 17 until 11. And it's funny that you put this one in there because Chris Paul, when he was traded, they got back Chris Kaman, who I think had made an all-star team. He only technically qualifies for this. He wasn't viewed by that point as any kind of a centerpiece of that trade. That ended up being more about Eric Gordon and a Wolves pick that the Clippers had from the Marco Yarrick salary dump. That looked very juicy, ended up only being number 10 overall. The Wolves finally actually put it together at least a little bit in 20 after going through myriad gyrations to keep that pick, including Mark Madsen shooting a bunch of threes in overtime in the last game of the season one year. But this is interesting because the NBA owned the Hornets, and David Stern, depending on who you talk to, at the behest of some of the other owners, said, no, we're actually not going to trade him to the Lakers. Remember, the Lakers had just won had gone to 3 finals in a row, and then they lost in the second round sweep, but still were the Lakers. So Chris Paul going there was not popular. And what the trade would have been was Pau Gasol and Lamar Odom. And I think the Pels would have also ended up with Goran Dragic, I want to say. Yeah, let me find actually exactly what it would have been. Need to find that in of who was going. It was a 3-way trade. The Rockets were supposed to be kind of an interesting team. I think they're going to get Goran Dragic, maybe Lamar Odom as well. And I have to actually type that in. But in terms of like, how would you say the trade that did happen turned out as I looked that up?
Yeah, not as consequential as New Orleans hoped. The thought was Eric Gordon was a budding star. Yeah, Chris came in. The threshold for whether I put a trade in the spreadsheet for us to talk about was a veteran star, a key component. And I went back and forth on this one. This was obviously mostly about Eric Gordon. He didn't turn into that future star New Orleans hoped. He wasn't happy in New Orleans. A lot of the time he signed an offer sheet trying to get away. They matched. Chris came in. If he ever was a star, didn't stay a star. And it's interesting that at the time, after the Lakers trade got vetoed, and that definitely would have qualified for this. That was definitely the more veteran heavy package. And that's the reason Stern cited for avoiding the trade. Whatever his actual reason or reasons were, he said, hey, we're rebuilding. It doesn't make sense to get these veterans. And so that's why he said he vetoed it. Everybody agreed at the time the package New Orleans actually got was better than the vetoed trade.
So here's what they would have ended up with in this 3-way deal. Gasol would have gone to the Rockets, and the Hornets, who would soon become the Pelicans, would have gotten Kevin Martin, Lamar Odom, Luis Scola, Goran Dragic, who actually made a 2014 All-NBA team, and a 2012 Knicks pick from Houston. Dragic wasn't viewed as anywhere near that type of player at the time. And Lamar Odom, basically, after getting traded away to Dallas, never played again due to some of his personal problems. And Kevin Martin had another year or so of being decent and then ended up going to OKC. Wasn't that? Yeah, he went to OKC in the James Harden deal.
Yeah, that was one I debated
was
putting
never
on.
heard from. Yeah, he was never heard from there. Yeah, Harden probably. Oh, just because you think Martin was like a centerpiece of the trade with Harden?
A key component, I'll say, that they wanted a veteran replacement in addition to the picks. But also, was Harden a star? Was Martin a star? Was Martin close up? I didn't put that one on, but it's at least borderline twice.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that, especially given the fact that Paul wanted to be in LA, he only had a year left on his deal, that they did as good as they could going for future assets, and they ended up with Eric Gordon, Austin Rivers, but they also got the number 1 pick in 2012 to get Anthony Davis, and then proceeded to squander him. Okay, yeah, this one wasn't the motivation between this Iverson for Billups deal that Detroit actually made the East Finals in 2008. I thought they actually had an underrated team that year, but most of the guys, Rasheed Wallace, most of the backbone of that team was on the downslope and ended up breaking down. They got Iverson. He only played 1 year for the team, but basically he was an expiring contract, and they wanted to do cap space in the summer of 2009. Wasn't that the big reason that Detroit moved Billups at that point?
Sort of. So it was two-pronged. It was one, and I ultimately went with, I think Allen Iverson was perceived as the bigger star at the time. It was one, let's get this start. Let's shake things up. Let's see what happens. Allen Iverson's an all-time great. If this works, cool. Maybe we resign him. You can figure it out. And then 2, there's the backup plan of the cap space. So they were definitely cognizant that Iverson was an expiring contract and they could let him walk, use the cap space. But it wasn't just that. A lot of it was about getting Allen Iverson, which turned out horribly for the Pistons, of course.
Yes. Yeah, it certainly did. Iverson was pretty much done as a high-level player, and Billups led the Nuggets to the West Finals and was pretty decent for them for another year or so. Yeah, that one, I don't know. That there wasn't, I don't think either team felt like a great need to trade either player. And
I
yeah,
think, well,
yeah.
I
No,
mean,
no, go ahead. You remember this better than I do, probably.
yeah, I mean, it's tough to say in Denver. They were a little more buttoned up about it. I don't think the Pistons felt a great need to trade Chauncey Billups. I think they felt a need to shake things up. And then Denver, Allen Iverson can wear out his welcome. He's difficult in a lot of ways. So I do think the Nuggets felt a little more, we've got to move Iverson. And he was at no question. Whether you argue about who is the bigger star on the court, the better player at that point, how it was perceived, no question Iverson was the bigger name. And so I do think I look at this more for these purposes from the Nuggets point of view of we've got this big name player, and Iverson was really good the year before. He fell off in a hurry in Detroit, and maybe there were signs we should have seen, but he was quite efficient. One of the most efficient seasons of his career the year before in Denver. So for the Nuggets to kind of get out ahead of it, say we're trading this big name and getting a quietly underrated and still productive, even on his big contract, Chauncey Billups, worked out well for Nuggets. I think to me, this is one of the ones I'm counting as a win for a team trading the bigger name for a lesser star.
I don't think we should talk about this Shaq for Marion thing. I think both of them were enough on the downside at that point, and there also wasn't necessarily a lot of trade. I mean, Shaq was getting into it with Pat Riley, and Miami was kind of done that year. And I think really there wasn't much out there for Shaq at that point, and the big appeal for Miami was that they were starting to put their 2010 plan in place. I think this one, though, from 04 is another pretty instructive one.
Yeah, the Orlando Magic traded Tracy McGrady to Houston for Steve Francis, a real star for star trade. I think of all the ones that don't fit my definition of somebody being a star, all-star before and after the trade. This one is the most in the spirit of it because Steve Francis was good for about 1 year in Orlando and then fell off quickly.
Yes, Francis had such an odd career. His second year, he looked like he was going to be unbelievable. Had 56% true shooting back when that meant something as a 23-year-old, and then never came close to equaling those heights again. And yeah, Orlando trading McGrady, I think he was close to done with his contract. He extended then in Houston. McGrady had been unbelievable, one of the all-time great underrated seasons in 02-03. Then he was said in a press conference, he assumed he was going to get out of the first round up 3-1 in the 1-8 matchup. And especially that was a little premature. Doc Rivers ended up blowing a 3-1 lead, which proved prescient. Obviously, going up against the 1 seed, they weren't favored. That wasn't like some disaster that if you look at who else was on that team with McGrady, it was pretty insane. But McGrady, that was one of the best seasons that a guard ever had. And he would never have a season quite like that again. But then the next year, he just completely fell apart. The Magic, I think, were 18-64, even with him playing a lot. And so it was clear that he had to be traded. They drafted Dwight Howard immediately after that. But yeah, they didn't get really any kind of future asset. Steve Francis was 26, and yeah, he basically never was heard from again in any kind of important capacity. Ended up getting traded to the Knicks the following year to pair up with Stephon Marbury, which not one of Isaiah Thomas's best moves.
I think one lesson from this that we'll see in other trades, when you have the greater star and another team is willing to trade a lesser star, you might be forced into it for whatever reason, where the Magic felt they had to trade McGrady, where that was the time to do it. If Houston's willing to trade Steve Francis, maybe that tells you something. Maybe it's not quite as good as it looks. The player, I think that trade was driven by the Magic trading Tracy McGrady. If somebody else who's not really looking to trade the player as far as is willing to make that player available, that could be a hint.
Yeah, and of course they traded McGrady, paired him with Yao Ming, who had just completed his rookie season, and then proceeded to never get out of the first round while McGrady was actually playing, as so famously was the case. This was another interesting one, and maybe it's not, I don't know if it's quite deserving of being on the list because the guys who were traded back were all pretty young guys. But Shaq in 2004, 2004 offseason for Lamar Odom. Also got Caron Butler in that deal. A Heat 2006 first round draft pick, the year that they actually won the championship with Shaq, which became Jordan Farmar. And then Brian Grant was also matching salary. Grant was actually a pretty terrible. He had actually like gotten a max contract right in the early days of the 99 CBA. And that's back when guys like Brian Grant got the max. So
the reason I think this qualifies, I think Lamar Odom was proven enough, and the Lakers were trying to prove to Kobe Bryant that he should re-sign. He was a free agent too, and so
yeah,
they weren't
in the summer of 04, right? I mean, did they? I think he had he already re-signed though when this deal was agreed to.
Well, I don't believe so. I think they made this trade first, so you're still trying to prove to Kobe that you're a winner, and then Lamar Odom stayed long enough to be a part of those championship Laker teams.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find the date on this. I remember it going into the off season a little bit more.
I think Kobe Bryant's free agency went into the offseason quite a bit too, if I remember.
Yeah, I mean he flirted with the Clippers, ended up going back to the Lakers, of course, in the end. But yeah, this is one where they certainly didn't. They still had Kobe Bryant at that point. You know that's certainly and it worked out. Lamar Odom actually became a part of probably their third best player on those championship winning teams in the later part of the decade.
All right, the Lakers agreed to the trade on July 14th, and then on July 15th, Kobe said he's re-signing.
Oh yes, that's right. I think the moratorium was a little bit longer at that point, but yeah, that's I think it was somewhat part and parcel there as well. So yeah, so I think the Lakers and Butler, he didn't do as much. I'm trying to remember what happened to him. I think he ended up.
I remember I had high
Washington
hopes
shortly thereafter. Yeah, I can't remember who he was traded for. It wasn't anyone of. Oh no, I do remember. It's Kwame Brown. They traded for Kwame Brown.
Yes. really made Kobe regret his decision.
Oh man, yeah, that was and Butler actually would go on to make 2 All-Star teams in the East in Washington as part of the triumvirate with I think it was Anton Jameson by that point and Gilbert Arenas. So I think that one worked out for the Lakers, but really a different situation because they still had a better player, at least that going forward, than Shaq on the roster and Kobe, and it felt like they needed to maintain with him.
I think that's something we run into in some of these where a team feels like, okay, maybe this isn't the best way to get value, or maybe it is, but we're too far down the road of winning. Now, there's a difference between having Kobe Bryant and Domantas Sabonis, but I think the Kings feel this way a little bit, that if we had tried to rebuild, then what do we do with Sabonis? And it's a complication. Again, different one with Kobe Bryant.
This one, I was like, this has to be a typo. The Bucks traded Ray Allen and gave up a first, which later became Luke Ridnour, and goes like the 14th pick, to the Sonics for Desmond Mason and Gary Payton. Maybe they just valued Desmond Mason so much.
Yeah.
He was like, a great athlete, never developed at all as a shooter, but Gary Payton was like in his mid-30s. Ray Allen would go on to, he was only really halfway through, if not even less than that, a Hall of Fame career, maybe even at his best years in Seattle. Now, I want to say Ray Allen might, I know Payton was about to be a free agent because he just signed with the Lakers in the offseason. I think his most notable contribution as a Buck was like getting into some sort of trouble in a strip club in Toronto. I can't remember whether that was when he was on the Sonics or the Bucks. I think it was as a Buck. And so, yeah. And then like Ray Allen ended up getting the number 5 pick later after leading the 04-05 Sonics, one of the best offenses relative to league and NBA history, and a second round playoff exit, and then ended up getting traded for Jeff Green years later. And obviously the Sonics were not long for Seattle, but that one, I can't believe that that's the package that Bucks team took. I mean, that seems insane to me.
The George Karl influence. George Karl wanted to be reunited with Gary Payton. That was part of it. And this was another one where it's tricky to figure out who the lesser star was. And you nailed it. One of the biggest clues I look for is which way did a pick go? If it's included, in my memory, I was pretty high on Desmond Mason at the time. I think that he was valued more highly than the pick. And so I do think Ray Allen was treated as the better star. And yeah, this is a great example of why you don't do this. You don't trade your younger, better, comparable star for an aging star, especially one on an expiring contract, just to appease a coach. Ray Allen and George Karl had their differences. Just a terrible reason to make a trade like this.
Jason Kidd, who is 28, to the Nets for Stephon Marbury, who is 24. This was basically a challenge trade.
Somewhat. I mean, I do think Jason Kidd was the more established star. He was first team All NBA at that point. I believe Marbury was a little younger, more dynamic, maybe had some more untapped upside. The Suns felt like they were going stale. The Suns also were facing, Jason Kidd had a domestic violence incident. They weren't, I think that they said that didn't influence the trade. Everybody kind of believes it did. And so, yes, in some ways it was a challenge trade. I think the Suns probably knew they were giving up what overall most people considered to be the better player.
Yeah, at that time, but also it was 28 versus 24. And obviously Marbury, he was still pretty good. Then he ended up getting traded to, he gave a couple of like lower end all-star seasons with the Suns, helped them get to the playoffs in 2003. Amari Stoudemire's rookie year, and then of course got traded to the Knicks, and that paved the way for Steve Nash to begin the 7 seconds or less era. Obviously, Sean Marion was all on those teams too. He might have even been the best player on those teams before Nash got there. But yeah, I mean, obviously the Nets went to back-to-back finals. Kidd was a stalwart there until 2008. So I think this was one where they just like, all right, we feel like this is better for our team. We feel like this is better for our team. Because there were no picks going back and forth. I think they were viewed by everyone involved to be pretty much equal as assets.
Mm-hmm. Well, are you counting this as a win for the Suns in that, hey, I think the argument would be they were pretty good. They didn't waste years. They could have maybe gotten more picks, younger players, less proven players, and been worse, but they didn't have those really down years. And then they still built themselves a really good team with Steve Nash. Maybe there's a little bit of luck involved, but I also think if you're choosing to go the tanking route, you're guaranteeing yourself those rough years, almost guaranteeing yourself those rough years in exchange for maybe upside still. It's not guaranteed on the other end that way either.
Nah, it's outcome-based decision-making, I would say, because they were expecting, I don't think they thought it was going to be that big of a downgrade on the floor. I mean, I think in 2001, they were a second-round playoff team, if memory serves, and make this deal, and then they get the 9th pick in the draft the next year. They weren't expecting that to happen, and then they were lucky enough to just happen to get Amari Stoudemire with that pick, and that's why they were able to start ascending again. I think they would have been much better off to just take the best future-focused assets rather than going for Marbury. I think they misevaluated that Marbury was anywhere close to the level of Jason Kidd, and the Nets just like made a much superior evaluation that Jason Kidd was way better than Stephon Marbury, which I don't know that a lot of people like quite appreciated at that time, particularly given that Marbury was older or sorry, was younger.
Yeah, there's no question this was great for the Nets and they came out ahead. But as we're looking at it from the team giving up the bigger stars perspective, yeah, I agree with you. I was mostly playing devil's advocate on that one, but I do think there's at least a little bit of a case. What's the next one you want to go to?
Chris Webber for Mitch Richmond in 1998.
Yeah, I'm hoping you have a little bit more memory of this one. What were the Wizards? Bullets Wizards? I don't even know what was Washington doing trading a younger Chris Webber for Mitch Richmond. I don't understand that one. In my memory, I didn't understand at the time. I also was 9 years old. It was in 98. I was 11 years old. Maybe that was the problem, or maybe that wasn't the problem.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of components to it. First off, the Wizards still owed picks going forward from acquiring Webber from Golden State. To begin with, Webber, he only played 1 year in Golden State. He had this crazy contract where he could have opted out after his first year. Didn't get along with Don Nelson, and yeah, like he had been injured. 97, they make the playoffs as the 8th seed, fall to the Bulls, and then he and Juwan Howard, like that group just had disappointed. I think they felt like his time had run out there. I don't remember the exact details of why they felt that they had to move. Yes, Calbert Cheney was on the Bullets at the time. Corey, thank you for that comment. And so, and I think maybe they're like, well, we got to stay competitive. We can't rebuild. And I mean, Mitch Richmond was 33. This was just one of these, like, you don't understand the aging girl. Like Mitch Richmond was, a one of the best shooting guards in the 90s. Unfortunately, the 90s was almost over. They also actually gave Richmond a big extension. They gave him a $10 million a year extension, which was a ton back then. And then they ended up buying him out. Actually, when Michael Jordan took over the Wizards in 2000 as a part owner and general manager, which he would then leave that position. He had to divest to go play for them again. And then Abe Pollin kind of fucked him over to not let him go back to being the GM. But Jordan actually did some pretty good cap gymnastics to get them out of Richmond and out of Juwan Howard and kind of reset them for the next era. But yeah, that was just an atrocious trade. Webber, of course, led the Sacramento Kings to by far their best era. They immediately made the playoffs in 1999 and had a great era until Webber hurt himself in the 2003 playoffs, and that was the end of that. But yeah, that one didn't work out too well for the Wiz.
Our next trade, I think, has two teams trading a greater star for a lesser star, because it was a three-way trade in 1997. Seattle sent Sean Kemp to Cleveland for Vin Baker coming from Milwaukee. I think that was going from, I think Kemp was perceived to be the greater star and a downgrade to Vin Baker. And we can talk about the reasons there. And then Milwaukee traded Vin Baker to Seattle, and they got Terrell Brandon from Cleveland. And I think that was also perceived to be going to a lesser star.
Yeah, and then Brandon would end up going to Minnesota later on, and then immediately got hurt. That's another one of the big what ifs of the KG era. That was post Marbury as well, with all these sliding doors here. And yeah, Kemp had one really good year in Cleveland, made the All-Star team, and then ate himself out of the league immediately. Ended up in Portland and Orlando a bit later, but was so overweight that he just couldn't do anything. Vin Baker had his own personal demons as well. The first year, I want to say, I think Seattle won 61 games the first year that they got Vin Baker, and then that kind of fell off again. The lockout sort of ruined a bunch of things. Also, Seattle just wasn't like a finals threat the way that they were with Kemp in his prime. I think they maybe made the right decision to move off of Kemp because he had his own issues, but then they acquired someone who would end up having the same. And Cleveland had Terrell Brandon. Those were the Fratello teams that had sort of been backing their way down dribble by dribble into the playoffs and playing 75 possession games. And so they had a chance to acquire a big talent. I think you would have to say that this trade worked for none of the teams. Yeah.
Well, I think I disagree. I think it was good for the Bucks. I think getting off Vin Baker, I think Terrell Brandon was good for them. They flipped him for Sam Cassell, who was a key part.
That's true. I forgot they flipped him for Cassell. Yeah. And then they did make the conference finals in 01. You're right.
Yeah. And it wasn't just like, it was lucky to flip him. Yeah. Brandon played well enough in Milwaukee that you could do that. So I do think it worked out well. And this, like you said, Seattle won 60 some games that first year with Vin Baker. It probably didn't work out, I guess, but it probably wasn't going to work out with Sean Kemp either. He wanted a $100 million contract. There was basically no way Seattle could give that to him. So the Sonics had to do something. And you have Gary Payton, you have a team that had just gone to the finals. I get the urge to remain competitive, get a decent replacement player for Kemp. Baker was a star in his own right. I don't think it was a disaster for Seattle. Let me rephrase that. I don't think it was a bigger disaster for Seattle than somehow finding a way to keep Kemp would have been.
1995, the Charlotte Hornets were locked in a contract dispute with Alonzo Mourning. It was a relatively paltry amount, if memory serves, with notorious tightwad George Shinn at the helm. And so they went ahead and traded Mourning with a package centered around Glenn Rice. And there was also a Miami first in the next year's draft. And yeah, I think that was I want to say it was the 95 off season that happened. Rice actually did blossom in Charlotte and became one of the league's best scorers. Those Charlotte teams won 50 games, I think, a couple of years in a row. The Hornets also traded the pick that was Kobe Bryant for Vlade Divac. They could have, in theory, had Kobe Bryant and Alonzo Mourning on their team. Would have been pretty good. I guess by the time Kobe was really good, Mourning ended up with his kidney issues. Like 2000, I think, was Mourning's last season at like a really like high level. But that was a great trade for Miami. They immediately became a contender in the East and caused countless millions to gouge their eyes out with repeated playoff series against the Knicks as a result. So,
I love those series.
Yeah. Have you ever got back and rewatched some of those, by the way? Do you still love them, or you loved them at the time?
I loved them at the time, and I think I still love them. It's a little more complicated now. I think this worked out for Charlotte. I think this is one of the ones where it's a case. You go for the good player, and you don't have to win a championship. Charlotte used to have one of the best fan bases in the league. Those teams were good. It wasn't, they didn't win a championship, but I think that worked out well. Glenn Rice had a satisfying tenure in Charlotte. And then they also flipped him in another, I would say, borderline trade that fits this condition, where they flipped him for Eddie Jones several years later. And I think that one worked out for Charlotte too. Now, probably the better move would just be to pay Alonzo Mourning that small amount more. But if you're not going to do that, if you're choosing what return to take, I think this one worked out for the Hornets.
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. I mean, they flipped Rice around, as you mentioned it, for Eddie Jones. And they were a solid team through the early 2000s, and then the Shinn ownership stuff. But we'll take this comment here about that. I think all but 3 teams should tank right now. I want to actually go through and say which teams I think should tank. Let's close on this one, which will take us back over 30 years from now. In 1992, this was another one of the quintessential ones in my mind that really solidified the philosophy of don't try to trade for like the lesser star.
Yeah, in 1992, the Philadelphia 76ers traded Charles Barkley to the Phoenix Suns, and the headliner of the return was Jeff Hornacek. Well, I got to be honest, I later learned he was a star. I just remember him as a role player on the Jazz. I had no idea he was a star. So tell me about the perception of Jeff Hornacek at the time and why that went wrong for Philadelphia.
Yeah, the Suns had built these teams around, and I think Hornacek made a couple all-star teams in Phoenix. Kevin Johnson was their star. They also had Tom Chambers, although he was on the downslide by the time of this trade. But they had some good teams. They easily could have made a finals in 1990. They upset the Lakers, and a really good Lakers team that had won 63 games in 1990 as well. And then we're always a quality unit that subject to some of the injury issues. But yeah, being able to not even have any kind of future assets for a Sixers team that part of this is one where they just totally misjudged things too. And the Sixers became one of the worst stretches in franchise history pre-Hinkie after this. But they had Barkley, who was a really good player, but Barkley, this may shock you, Dan, was not someone who, if he wasn't on the most competitive team or wanted to be traded, was going to give the best effort. So they missed the playoffs in 91-92 after they had gotten smoked in the second round in 90 and 91. and they clearly weren't going to get past the Bulls. Some of their guys were getting older. I think Johnny Dawkins, their point guard, got another injury, if memory serves. And so they didn't have any, like Hersey Hawkins was their only other player of any kind of note. They didn't have a decent center. So they don't make the playoffs. And so clearly you don't make the playoffs with Charles Barkley. Guess what, guys? Adding Jeff Hornacek in place of Charles Barkley, you're probably not going to make the playoffs at that point in time. And so to not, again, go for a more future-focused package, I mean, even just to say, hey, Phoenix, just trade us all the draft picks that you have instead of these guys. I mean, there needed to be matching salary, of course, but this was, and, Tim Perry, Lang, like they'd been kind of role players for Phoenix. I don't think, I certainly at the time as a 12-year-old didn't think of either of those guys as having much all-star play. Like Lang was kind of a plotting center. Perry was a combo forward who could jump, but it didn't really have much of a skill level. And yeah, just an atrocious trade by Philly. They ended up getting nothing of kind. And then they managed to trade Hornacek for Jeff Malone like 2 years later, which was also a terrible trade. I can't remember whether they got a pick in that or not from Utah, but that was a huge move for Utah to get Hornacek. But Hornacek was your third or fourth best player. He was not suited to be the best player on a Philly team. All right, so what is our accounting here?
Can I just want to throw out one of the older ones, and the list goes back a little longer.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll put those in the dunks for the real junkies who are curious about them, where we don't have to analyze them all. But one that stood out to me was in 1978, the 76ers traded George McGinnis to the Nuggets for Bobby Jones. And McGinnis was viewed as a real talented player, bigger star. Jones was an all-star in his own right, but more of a defensive specialist. And that's one where I think it worked out because the 76ers, I think this was one driven by them kind of being tired of McGinnis, but two, they targeted somebody who they really thought would fit their style, would be the missing piece of what they need. And that worked out because he helped them win a championship. He was that defensive player that they needed. I see some shades there of what Dallas did looking for Anthony Davis. Still don't like the trade.
Well, McGinnis, they also had Dr. J at the time, and they had Doug Collins, who would then get hurt. They had a bunch of other good players, and McGinnis was
not on that level, but yeah, Kyrie Irving's very like that. But I'm just saying the idea of it, of where the Mavericks targeted somebody. I think that's different than a lot of these. I think one thing we see in a lot of these is it's a trade of circumstance. This team has to trade their bigger star. Okay, now what? Where the Mavericks seem to be the one who drove this. They chose to trade their bigger star because they wanted Anthony Davis. So that is an outlier.
Yeah, that is true. They were like, this is the guy that we want. Now, I think there were, and Danny and I went through it the night of the trade, where I really was like, if they were trying to be good right now, who else could they have targeted that would have made them good this year, as good as Anthony Davis? And I said, yeah, I don't think there was anybody necessarily better. And as we've noted, you look at these trades. I mean, number one, very few of the guys who were traded, I don't know if anyone really is of the stature of Luka at the time. And then also the guys coming back, no one was of the stature of AD at the time. This was an unprecedented trade for that reason.
I just real quick, I think you're discounting a little bit who could have shook loose. Like if you said from the Lakers perspective, if this trade hadn't happened, if you said, hey, what if the Lakers wanted to trade Anthony Davis? Like what's the most they could get? And you went team by team and thought about it. And somebody suggested, oh, they could get Luka Doncic. You would think that was crazy. I'm open to some ideas of that. Some crazy good players could have been available if the Mavericks shopped it. I don't know that.
Well, no, but the reason I don't think they would have been was because it would have been sending Luka to somewhere that didn't have confidence he would resign, whereas the Lakers did have that confidence.
I hear that.
And so I don't the Bucks would not have given up Giannis. Right? That's the sort of, yeah.
I'm not saying this is the case, but what if the Bucks were getting murmurs that Giannis was, maybe close to asking out? Maybe they would have. Maybe they would have said, well, look, we've got a star we're afraid is going to ask out this summer. We can get Luka Doncic. Let's do that. And then maybe we can convince him to stay. And if we can't, we can flip him. I'm not predicting like that was the case, saying that was the case. But I think if you canvass the league, maybe you uncover something like that. I think that's very possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Although you also then open yourself up to Doncic controlling the process in a way that
Sure, if
they didn't like.
if he controls the process and makes it difficult for them, they might have had to end up with a really bad return like Anthony Davis and a single first round pick and Max Christie.
I am not defending, I am explaining.
Yeah.
To be clear. I'm trying. It doesn't do anyone any good in analyzing this trade for me to just say the things that everyone already says and everyone already knows, and that I have also already said. I think there's still at least to try to say, all right, if you make the same false suppositions that were made, then how do you get to this point? Okay, so here are the NBA standings. Let's see if I feel all but 3 teams should tank right now from a sledge brain nerd. And so he does say right now. So I mean, at this very moment, teams that I believe should be tanking. Now, I guess does that mean tank in the sense of like they should make moves to tank? We're past the trade. Maybe we'll go back in time to the trade deadline. Let's say that teams that I believe should have made moves to tank at the deadline. That didn't. So the Blazers would be one of those. Like, I think they should at least move Rob Williams. Although I talked to Mike Richmond today at Locked On Blazers, and I was like, I actually think it's more defensible to have not made the moves this year for the Blazers just because their guys didn't have much value. They should have made them even well before this. I would say the Phoenix Suns absolutely should have just traded everybody that wasn't nailed down and tried to get as much as they could, or at least thought about it. Maybe there wasn't that good of a return. Okay, I wouldn't say anybody above that in the West. So the teams that haven't done it, the Suns, the Blazers, the Pels, I don't think so. They're so bad they don't really need to do it to tank anymore. I certainly would have listened on some of their guys. The Wizards, yeah, they should have traded everything they could, but there just wasn't anything out there. You're probably better off just holding on to like a Brogdon or something. And they did trade Kuzma, so I think they did everything I would have wanted. The Hornets are already doing it. The Raptors, yeah, I would have seen what I could get for like Jakob Poeltl. There isn't really anyone else for what they're trying to do that would have made sense. The Nets, I certainly would have traded Cam Johnson away for whatever they could have gotten for him, unless it was just like, a late first and nothing else. Chicago, yes, should have traded Kobe White and Ayo Dosunmu. Yeah, that's probably about it. That's probably about it. So I don't know, 3 or 4 extra teams from who actually did. Yeah, Corey says, isn't Phoenix's pick out to Brooklyn unprotected? Yeah, it wouldn't be about tanking to get the draft pick. It would just be get everything that you can for Devin Booker and Kevin Durant right now, because the value will probably just go down. You get those guys out of there while they still have value to a team for this year's playoffs. And Phoenix's pick actually is now owed to the Houston Rockets. And an executive texted me about this the other day, Dan. You remember when the Brooklyn Nets traded Phoenix's 2025 pick to the Houston Rockets as part of that huge package so that they could have control of their own draft pick? There's a possibility that they may do that and have actually given up a better pick than they get for themselves. If the Phoenix Suns miss the playoffs and like jump ahead of Brooklyn, isn't that just hilarious? I'm glad that I got that text, because that's like one of the funniest things that I could think about.
Well, man, now I've got something to root for the rest of this year. That's incredible.
I think we will all be rooting for it for sure. Let's do some news here.
Just real quick, I think I gave some of my takeaways. Did you have anything else on the stars? I'd love to hear more about what lessons you learned, how it applies to this year.
Yeah, I think we went through it. I think my thesis is largely proven. I mean, to really get into it, we'd also have to look at which teams went for more future focused assets and how that turned out. But generally the history of teams that really, really try to rebuild and trade everything away when they can, and get future assets. Like the teams that have really tried that the way I would try it, the history is pretty decent. At least they
Yep.
put themselves into a good position, even if they, uh, Sixers didn't particularly execute very well from that good position. I mean, even so, like just like even if this Joel Embiid era never goes beyond what it's been, I think most Sixers fans would say it was worth 3 years of abject losing to have had Joel Embiid on their team for the next 10 years. They certainly seemed that way when he won MVP. They all seemed very happy. A lot of vociferous arguments in the guy's favor. Like that's what you want as a fan, right? You want someone that you can make overly vehement arguments about on the internet and get pissed and denigrate all the other players that are deemed to be competing with him.
You know what? You can get a superstar like that without choosing to be awful for 4 years too.
So I watched the point of education video, which you put in the dunks. I think it was yesterday. Didn't see a ton that was new there. The one thing that and we've seen a few more of these of late, that I think it may presage is they had more stuff on potential flopping violations. And so I think we're going to just see a few more of those called in the coming days. That's probably my biggest takeaway there. What else do we need to talk about injury-wise here?
Jaylen Brown missed the Celtics game against the Pistons on Wednesday. He's questionable against Cleveland tomorrow. For Cleveland, Darius Garland, who had been out with a hip injury, is not on the injury report. It'd be fun to see those teams at full strength.
Yeah, that's definitely one I'm going to watch, and we'll talk about it. The plan is to do awards actually on Sunday, but hopefully we can find a time to at least discuss that Cleveland-Boston matchup. Those have been really good. For the Clippers, Norm Powell, questionable versus the Lakers on Friday. Kawhi Leonard did return in their victory over the Bulls, although James Harden was the big star there with a huge second half. That was on Wednesday. So presumably both Powell and Kawhi, well, I shouldn't say I presume Powell is questionable, but hopefully they can get back their full group and start to make some kind of a push there. I do think they could be pretty interesting. Again, Kawhi, he's had some fits and starts, hasn't really, like the on-off stuff is really good, but he hasn't really exploded and looked quite like the player that he was last year yet.
Anthony Edwards, who hurt his calf in the last game, is playing against the Lakers tonight. He was called questionable. Rudy Gobert with his back injury, Julius Randle with a groin injury are still out. Dante DiVincenzo participated in practice yesterday, so he's got to be nearing a return, it would seem.
This Gobert thing is concerning to me, that he missed the game before the break, tried to come back in practice, then re-injured it, and hasn't really been doing anything in practice since then. So it makes me feel like that this could be a longer-term issue with him. Randall, there was talk he could come back during the trip. Now, however, he's not with the team. That may be because I think he's expecting a child relatively soon. And then DiVincenzo, yeah, he's supposed to be back on this trip, although I don't believe he's playing right now against the Lakers. And he is not. And then Edwards, just want to keep an eye on that, a nagging calf issue. It seems like he's able to play. He also was dealing with a groin that was kind of difficult for him to warm up. You know, these muscle injuries that are nagging are a little bit of a different beast than the ones that actually like make you miss time. But it's also something that kind of could get worse at any point.
Yeah, for the Knicks, Ariel Hukporti is going to be out for a while. In his first career start, I mean, and this is also happening because Karl-Anthony Towns is out. He tore his meniscus, and so Towns is questionable to play tomorrow against the Grizzlies. Obviously, no Hukporti for a while. I think the estimate I saw was 4 to 6 weeks. And New York traded away Jericho Sims to Milwaukee before the trade deadline. Mitchell Robinson should be coming back soon, I think the next game or two. So that'll be some center depth, but just as the Knicks are losing a bunch of center depth.
Yeah, Hook Porty, 4 to 6 weeks, so that sounds like a meniscus trim and a small one. I mean, we're at the point in the season now, and they're going to have other centers back. You wouldn't expect him to figure again, although you would imagine that they moved on from Jericho Sims. They dumped him with cash and got DeLon Wright, who I don't think is going to particularly figure for the Knicks. Sims actually contributed for the Bucks in there and has been playing for them. I mean, and maybe you'd feel like they could use him. They also have Robinson coming back, but with Towns ailing with the knee tendonitis, that's something that he'll probably be able to come back and play through, but could also linger. We'll have to keep an eye on his performance. They're going to have to manage that for a while, which Tom Thibodeau and the Knicks are not necessarily known for doing. And yeah, you've got Josh Hart with the knee issue, and Anunoby has this foot/toe thing. So these nagging issues are starting to crop up for the Knicks. Let's see if they're able to get right by the playoffs or if they're going to kind of be on the downslope. But yeah, bad news for Porty, and hopefully for Mitchell Robinson, he'll be on a minutes limit too. Like, they're going to be under some pressure with Hook Porty out. Towns, they can always move pressures Achua to center a little bit too. So they should be okay, but some of these things are kind of adding up for New York.
For Philadelphia, Eric Gordon is undergoing surgery. I think I saw an estimate that he'll be able to come back in May. I kind of suspect the 76ers will be done well before that.
Yes, and I mean, I guess technically he could be released and signed somewhere and then come back during the playoffs. That seems just as far-fetched as the Paul George thinks that the Sixers competing is. And Joel, we're supposed to hear something about him in the next couple of days. Quentin Grimes and Justin Edwards did return from knee and ankle issues in a pretty close loss to the Knicks. Jalen Brunson went crazy down the end on Wednesday with 10 points in the last 3 minutes to win that one for New York. Circling back on a couple of things for best contracts, there is no team option for Jalen Suggs. Got that nailed down. I was actually right in my mind to begin with. I didn't get fooled by the agents. Yeah, that was just a data issue. We apologize for that. And then we also had a debate in part one of best contracts about whether rookie scale deals are in the aggregate over or underwater. One of the dumbest arguments I've ever made on the program. Apparently, if you really look at it statistically, that just the value of someone like Victor Wembanyama on a rookie scale deal just so far outweighs KP, we kind of put it to him. He made a great point that if you look at year 4, all these guys who are in the 21 draft, they're collectively making something around, mid 100 millions. And then if you look at their salaries for next year that they're going to make, it's like 300 million. So it's like, yes, rookie scale deals in aggregate are still the best value that you're going to get. And I was way overrating. I took generally betting on rookies sucking and the young players sucking is a winning bet, but in this time I took it way too far.
Maybe we can bug KP. Yeah. Maybe we can bug KP a little more because I'm curious where it turns. Right, I would think rookies probably aren't worth it. Sophomores, I guess, are, and juniors, fourth-year players, I would guess they're worth it. But I'm curious exactly when it turns.
Well, and particularly because those more expensive years of the rookie scale, if the guy isn't working out, those just get culled by the team options getting declined. But even if you were forced to run through the entire rookie scale deal on all these guys, it still wouldn't be close.
In Phoenix, Bradley Beal missed tonight's game against the Pelicans with a calf issue. This is the first game of a back-to-back.
Yeah, hopefully that's all it is. He did play well in their nonetheless desultory loss to Toronto. He has been in the starting lineup, one available. Robert Williams, who probably should have been traded by the Blazers. He's now has a designation rather than a sore knee of actually a knee sprain. He's going to miss his 4th straight with that. Of course, DeAndre Ayton is also out. A long-term absence with the calf issue. That's going to be supposedly at least a month. So it's Klingon and then Jabari Walker backing him up as the Blazers bigs at the moment.
Jakob Poeltl, who the Raptors maybe should have traded, came back after missing 7 games with a right hip pointer. But now Scotty Barnes is questionable with his own hip issue. Toronto plays the Bulls tomorrow.
Yeah, that'll be a critical game for the 10th seed. And yeah, Namson pointed out in the comments that Toronto has a really easy schedule the rest of the year. I haven't looked at that. He says, not sure they can take even if they wanted to. You always can. If you really want to, you always can. And particularly because I don't think the Bulls are going to do that. Utah's tank brigade, John Collins has been in and out with his back issues, questionable for Friday against the Wolves. The Wolves will be on the second night of a back-to-back. He's missed 3 straight. Colin Sexton has been out for since January. He's questionable to play against the Wolves on Friday, coming back from an ankle, as is Lauri Markkanen with his own back issue. He's in the midst of a 2-game absence.
PJ Washington, battling his ankle injury, was downgraded to out tonight against the Hornets, his former team.
What is
396?
What is the score of that game? Oh, the Hornets stayed within 7. They didn't set the record for the worst 5-game stretch.
Good for Charlotte. Congratulations to the Charlotte Hornets for losing by 7.
Yeah, 38 minutes for Kyrie Irving and this was the Charlotte Hornets with no LaMelo either. No LaMelo. Mark Williams did have 26 points and 16 rebounds against the Mavs, who started Moses Brown, who had 20 points of his own and 11 rebounds plus 14. Anyway, enough box score reading here. For Chicago, Nikola Vucevic was downgraded earlier in the week with a calf. He is now doubtful to play in that huge game against the Raptors on Friday. Ayo Dosunmu is questionable. He's kind of been questionable-ish, but you don't really, it seemed like it might be a longer-term absence for a second. He's missed 3 straight, but certainly they could use him as one of their few decent defenders on the perimeter. I am a little bit concerned about that PJ Washington ankle, just because that happened before the break, and that hopefully he didn't re-injure it. It's not. Charlotte did get back Seth Curry and Daquan Jeffries in the game against the Dallas Mavericks. This one's pretty interesting, particularly considering how competitive Brooklyn has been lately. That Cam Thomas will finally return, it looks like, against the Blazers Friday.
Norm Powell's questionable Friday against the Lakers. He's missed
last. No, I already talked about them.
Oh, you already did that one.
It's such a you really are replacing Danny in every possible way. Just pretend like you're acting to that you did pay attention to me while I was talking about the Clippers already. It's also my fault for not deleting it from the sheet. But let me go through and make sure I delete everything else that I already talked about as well, just to avoid that mistake again.
Yeah, now I'm gun shy. I don't know which one to pick, because I see some that you already said that I think should be deleted. I'm going to delete my PJ Washington one. I'm going to let you take the last one. I'm too scared now.
Yeah. Alex Sarr didn't play on Wednesday with that left ankle issue. And I just wanted to comment on this because I think this is his re-injury. Washington is going to be very, very conservative with anybody given their situation and any of their young guys. But since he hurt the same ankle that he hurt before the break, I'm guessing this is going to be a more of an absence as they make sure that gets fully in order for him. Oh, and also Richard Jefferson is going to call the finals. He's going to be the third person in the 3-person booth with Mike Breen and Doris Burke. And I think Jefferson does a good job. He adds like a nice bit of levity. He probably would have been my choice there among the ESPN analysts. Legler's pretty good too, but I think he's got like a little more chemistry there with that booth. Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations, Richard Jefferson. I will be listening on the Dunc'd On playback.
That's a good point. Yeah, I guess I don't really know that much how good these announcers are in the playoffs, because I'm always just doing it myself with Danny. All right, that will do it for today's show and for this week. We'll be back on Sunday. Thanks so much for subscribing. Of course, you can subscribe to our free daily newsletter. Link to that is in the show notes, and to Dunc'd On Prime to get every Dunc'd On episode plus 5 days a week, a little bit less than that while Danny's on paternity leave because Dan also has to do this podcast. But that's the general way that we do it. And every Hollinger and Duncan, etc., etc. Talk to y'all on Sunday.